Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. A fascinating qualifying session today in Imola. Max Verstappen takes his 8th pole position in a row, tying the record of Aryton Senna, but that was not the only storyline of the day by any means. Ferrari arguably could have had pole position. McLaren certainly could have, if not for a toe that Verstappen got in that final part of Q3 by none other than Nico Hulkenberg. Could Hulkenberg, if he hadn't signed the Audi contract, be Verstappen's teammate for next season, given that Sergio Perez had a real stinker today? And that raises serious questions, especially with the RBs in the hands of Yuki, Tsunoda and Ricciardo, doing a rather stellar job. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. A couple of storylines to lead off here with. First of all, we saw the other day rumours around a Chicago Grand Prix, which apparently isn't happening. Apparently, if they are going to do another Grand Prix, which they probably will at some point, it's probably going to be in Asia. Potentially Southeast Asia, Potentially Southeast Asia. Apparently Thailand is the front runner for it, but also the possibility of a South Korean Grand Prix returning. So yeah, just a quick update on that. There was also this spotted today with Valtteri Bottas in the hospitality of Williams. Now we know that Bottas is far from convinced he is going to maintain that seat next year at Sauber, which is going to become Audi. So we know that Hulkenberg has signed there officially now, although if he'd have held out, maybe there was another seat on the grid somewhere available, as we shall get into. But Bottas is not sure that he's going to have that seat next season. Obviously, we don't know what they're going to do, whether they bring in somebody else alongside Hulkenberg, which could be Sainz if he goes down that route, or whether it's Bottas, or even they could keep Zhou, give him, the Chinese connection might be somewhat valuable, although Bottas has comprehensively outperformed Zhou over the last several rounds. Bottas, though, had a 15-minute meeting with James Vowles about the possibility, you'd imagine, of a Williams return. So that is definitely on the card to want to keep your eyes on. But let's talk about practice before we got into qualifying, because this in and of itself was very interesting. The car was no doubt a nightmare yesterday for Red Bull, but we talked about it in yesterday's video. Overnight, they were going to make some setup changes. They were almost certainly going to put their car in a far better spot. Whether that was going to be good enough, that's another question entirely, but apparently they also ran a substantially lower engine mode. So there was more performance in that Red Bull than we saw yesterday, and with many setup changes, they got things somewhat right for today. Kimi Antonelli as well was racing in Formula 2 this weekend at Imola. Behrman had a solid sprint race today. Antonelli had a poor start in the F2 sprints, but look, based on his time in the F1 car, he's fast, he's consistent, looks like the real deal, says James Allison. So that just kind of goes to show what Mercedes seem to think of this guy and why he is, well, probably going to be in their car at some point in the future. This, though, is Fernando Alonso, who has been struggling really the last couple of rounds with various problems. Obviously, Miami, he said, yeah, he had a really awful Grand Prix by his standards. It is interesting how before Fernando signed his new deal, he was on fire, and then once he signed the new deal with Aston Martin, it's kind of, fell off the boil somewhat. I think he was out-qualified by Stroll 3 times all of last season, and he's already been out-qualified by Stroll 3 times this season. This is one example. He had a crash in practice, then qualifying didn't go his way. He had an off at the start of practice, the start of qualifying, and that was kind of enough to put him in a position where he couldn't get the lap time he wanted, and it's so competitive right now, especially around Imola, from P1 to P20. But kind of anything was possible here. And Alonso was out of there right at the back of the pack. Now, Hamilton was on the radio to Bono being like, hang on a second, how am I losing 0.8 of a second in a straight line? And, well, that's basically what was happening. However, the Red Bull was even faster in a straight line. The Red Bull made some setup adjustments going into qualifying that made it a car which was suffering somewhat, not suffering, but slower than the McLaren in Sector 2, Sector 3, but it did have more straight line speed, and that was used to Max Verstappen's great advantage. It will mean that Verstappen is going to be hard to overtake tomorrow, but if it rains tomorrow, more grip is better because it preserves the tyres better and gives you substantially more grip in the wet conditions. So, and also just a weaker rear wing in general means you're probably not going to preserve the tyres as well as you might do otherwise. So we're getting to qualifying in a second, but don't be convinced that this is going to be a Max Verstappen runaway victory just yet, because the data doesn't necessarily support that. We saw drivers taking a lot of curb here at this chicane as well, and Hamilton took so much that he had all 4 wheels off the track, not over the white line, but literally off the track here as he bounds over this curb. We saw, though, at the same spot, Perez in the wall, and this was the start of kind of his day going wrong. And we've kind of, I wouldn't say I've been waiting for this precisely, but it's felt to me that on weekends where the Red Bull is absolutely dominant, Perez is fine, like he can hold his own, he can be a few tenths off max, and that's okay for, P3, P2, something like that. But on weekends where the Red Bull struggles, Perez remains a bit of a liability, and I think we saw that today. I mean, last year when I was here in Toronto watching the Monaco Grand Prix, we know what happened at Monaco qualifying last year when he put it in the wall at into Zandvoort right at the first corner. And again, we see today Perez having another stinker, really. So the car wasn't in a great spot on Friday. They got it right. They got it good enough to be able to be a car that can secure pole position. But in Perez's hands, he just wasn't happy with it, really. And he was off the track here in practice. He broke his front wing big time. That caused a red flag, and at the end of that practice session, just to zoom out real quick on this, it was Piastri P1, Norris P2, Sainz P3. Now there was a couple of red flags, and that meant that by the time they got the session resumed, there was only a couple of drivers that actually could get in a clean lap here. Piastri was one of them. He put in a 1:15.5, which was pretty damn competitive, and qualifying got faster than that, obviously, but it didn't get too much faster, too much quicker. So Piastri put in a 1:15.5. These were the overall lap times from quali, but they weren't particularly representative really on what actually was the pace, because there was only a few drivers that got a clean lap in after the red flag occurred. Now, Toto Wolff said this to Sky Sports, which I thought was pretty funny, because as soon as I read this, I thought, yeah, let's see about that, Toto, come the qualifying session. But yeah, Sky Sports says the McLaren are a chunk ahead in quali and race pace, and then the Ferraris, the Red Bull and the Mercedes are all bunched up together. So to me, this sounded like wishful thinking from Mercedes, that they were actually going to be more competitive with the Red Bulls than, might have been expected. And of course, come qualifying, Mercedes' predictions were not true at all, as always. Qualifying then, of course, gets underway in front of the Tifosi, and it was a fascinating start here to qualifying because it was so competitive from top to bottom. Verstappen went P1, Piastri went P1, Sainz and Leclerc were on the mediums in the first part here to save some soft tyres because, they were confident they could get through on those mediums, which they did rather impressively. I think Leclerc ended up maybe, 6-7 hundredths off the fastest time in Q1 on the medium, so I thought, wow, this could be very interesting indeed. But at the end of Q1, it was some usual suspects going out, but Fernando Alonso was a surprise. I mean, Stroll was in P13, which wasn't great, but yeah, Alonso was a good few tenths off the pace. We had both kick Saubers out of there again, Zhou and Bottas. Sargent P17, Albon, snuck into Q2. Magnussen was out because he got impeded hard by none other than Oscar Piastri, that we'll dive into in a second. Hulkenberg, though, by the way, he was P1 for a brief period, and that clearly has some pace in his hands. Great qualifier, we know, but wow, that was impressive to see. I do want to give some credit quickly to Bottas, though, just because when you're not in a great car, good performances go under the radar, if you know what I'm saying. Like, no one's really talking about Bottas this season particularly, but it's not like he's having a bad year. Like, he's in the last 16 races, he's beaten Zhou 15 of those 16 times, and it's 7-0 this time in 2024. So, very impressive, and yes, he's adding Q1, but that doesn't necessarily tell the full picture. This was that impeding moment here as well at the first chicane, when Magnussen was clearly impeded here by Piastri, and Piastri was afterwards like, yeah, that weren't great, was it? But hopefully I'll get away with it type thing. And of course, Magnus ends up going out of Q1 and is not a happy man as a result. Now, as the session progressed, we saw what happened with Piastri. We'll get to that in a second. And then this happened during Q2. Yuki Tsunoda, basically out of nowhere, stuck at P2, ahead of Max, ahead of both McLarens, just behind Leclerc at this moment. So that RB, I mean, this is why Zach Brown was concerned about the ever-increasing relationship, shall we say, between RB and Red Bull, because we know that they're getting closer to each other geographically and in pure concept-wise, and that car is getting better. But that car means that the RB, on its day, can compete with Sergio Perez in his Red Bull, and that is when the questions start to be raised, because Perez was eliminated from Q2. Ocon, Gasly, the Alpine briefly looked better, then it fell away. Stroll P13, Albon P14, but Perez knocked out in P11, didn't improve by enough, and yeah, he was eliminated by 1.5 hundredths of a second, so 15,000th of a second. It was obviously very competitive, but the man he was knocked out by was Daniel Ricciardo. And this is a big question mark being raised here, right? Because, look, so far this season, Perez has been solid and probably better than I expected. But it was about this time last year when Perez's season started to go off the rails, and he had a difficult time regaining once things started to go downhill. His championship position is still fine, but there is clearly more competition now. He can't just rock up and secure P2, P3 with no problems. Now he's in competition with the Mercedes, the RBs, and then he's straight up slower at this type of circuit and on this type of track and on this type of day than the Ferraris and the McLarens. So knocked out by Danny Rick, Yuki Tsunoda ends up P3 of course here, which was mega from him, but just goes to show that Perez in the Red Bull, in a car that, yes, was tricky all weekends, but they put it together when it mattered. And the car looked so much more stable through Aqua Minerale and elsewhere than it did on the Friday. And as Checo says, yeah, it wasn't a good weekend overall. We've been playing up and down with the car. Then Q1, we went out on a new tyre, started Q2 on the scrub tyres. I made the mistake of the chicane, lost the 2/10 I needed to progress. So, sure, you make a mistake, it's going to cost you big around this type of circuit. Max showed we made good progress, but I didn't get a chance to show it, which is interesting. Perez often speaks like this, doesn't he? When things go wrong, he talks about, well, we've been doing this, and I didn't get a chance to show you the pace, which I don't really understand, because he had the same session that everybody else did, and it didn't work out. So Marco says, look, it was unfortunate. I don't think Marco and the rest of Red Bull are going to throw him under the bus just yet. But I think if he continues to have a bad race tomorrow and doesn't make the progress through the field that they'd be expecting him to, especially because he's behind both RBs, right? If he finishes behind one of the RBs, either Tsunoda or Ricciardo, and obviously, Ricciardo and Checo might have a good battle tomorrow. It'd be very fascinating, wouldn't it, to see how that race goes tomorrow. And if things don't go so well, will Red Bull change their minds on extending his contract? Quite possibly, yes. So Q2 ends like this. It was super tight to qualify through. And it's funny that the Mercedes, after all this talk, well, we're better this weekend, it's looking good, it ain't looking good. And to be fair, they were like half a second off. What's embarrassing for Mercedes, and continues to be embarrassing, is the fact that it wasn't long ago that they were down there with several tenths off the pace, as were McLaren. And we look today, we see what McLaren have achieved in the last couple of years. We see what Mercedes have achieved in the last couple of years. It's obviously night and day. Now, this first lap from Max here was mega, and I thought that might be good enough for pole, but it actually wasn't good enough for pole. He had to improve again on his second lap, which he did. And this is what makes Max so good. I mean, you can talk about the car all you want, and that's justified. Obviously, the car is great. But the reality is, someone's got to step up in the big moments and deliver a big lap, and that's exactly what Max did. He was big time fired up for this one as well, because he knew this was a challenge. Like, what happened this weekend from all the free practice sessions, the struggles with their car, for Max to turn up and deliver the lap that he did. Now, would he have had pole without a bit of a toe? Maybe not, but still, I mean, you've got to say, most consecutive poles in F1 history now is tied between Ayrton Senna, between 88 and 89, and, between Max Verstappen at the end of last year to the present day. Remarkable timeline. But Piastri and Norris were super close. And honestly, if the first sector was a bit better for these guys, and honestly, I was really hoping that on the final runs we were watching Charles Leclerc, I know that Leclerc didn't get as close as he would have liked to, but I knew that Leclerc was going to send it so hard in the first sector, and Sainz honestly was nowhere near Leclerc's pace really this weekend. Leclerc ended up 2/10 off, but he lost that in sector 1. Like, if he had a better sector 1, it could have been on. But it doesn't seem like Ferrari have turned up and their car is absolutely, rapid. Tsunoda actually out-qualifies Hamilton as well to secure a P7 for him. Ricciardo was P9 ahead of Hulkenberg, and it's interesting that Hulk, doesn't he? He puts in great laps in Q2, Q1, and then, doesn't always work out in Q3. But this was the key moment, actually, that was mentioned, that Nico Hulkenberg gave Max Verstappen a massive tow down the start-finish straight. All the way until this point of the start-finish straight, he gave him a tow, and, you can argue it's good positioning by Red Bull to put him in this spot, but also Nico Hulkenberg giving him a tow. It's interesting, isn't it? Because apparently Max gave him a tow in Q2, so, Max is playing chess, not checkers here, it seems, and is getting Hulkenberg to give him a tow back, because this gained Max about the pole margin, we believe, in terms of, hundredths of a second. This gave him pretty much the extra time that he needed to secure pole, those, 7 or so hundredths of a second. So here is Max getting that big tow from Nico down the main straight, and that put him at 340 kph. Everyone else was at 330. Now, I think that Max was at 335 anyway, because his car was set up to be better straight line speed than the other ones. But still, those extra few kph definitely paid the dividends, right? And obviously, there was also this talk from Eric Van Haren that apparently Max Verstappen was told just before his final lap that someone had bet against Max for pole, and apparently that was Helmut Marko, and then GP said to Max, hey, like, someone internally here has said you ain't going to get pole, and then Max, of course, goes out and delivers a lap good enough for pole position. But yeah, very interesting from Hulkenberg, isn't it, that it's not like he's auditioning for the Red Bull seat because he signed his new deal with Audi, but, definitely in hindsight, you might look at that team and think, could Hulkenberg have been a good partner to Max? Maybe there's evidence to say yes. Great driver, great qualifier, obviously. Sure, his tyre management in race conditions has been a bit of a question mark, and maybe for understandable reasons, but good qualifier. He's not going to put it out in Q2 in a Red Bull that often, which Perez, of course, has done today, for example. And he's helping out the team. So, we looked at the numbers here and people have analysed it and said, yeah, pretty much this was maybe what gave Max the pole position here, which is good strategy from his side and good kind of teamwork with a guy that isn't his teammate. But what it does mean is that for tomorrow, we do have a very competitive front of the field because Perez is nowhere near to help Max out, and he has to deal with some very competitive cars behind. The big news, though, is for McLaren that while their car may be the fastest over a single lap, and who knows in race pace, I mean, we saw in Miami they were very competitive, and they say their car will be better here than it was in Miami, and they won the race back then. They do not have their drivers right next to each other, which is going to be a problem because of the Oscar Piastri thing we'll get to. Ferrari as well was saying, look, their upgrade hasn't brought all the performance they hoped for yet. There is talk that there's more in those upgrades than we've seen so far. Like, if they get the setup right, if like there's more to be unlocked, basically, that they will figure out over time. And apparently all the problems have not been resolved by this, but rather there are some more problems they will need to resolve over time. Sainz as well said, look, the media talking about this massive upgrade, and look, I can't tell you the numbers, but you'd be surprised it's smaller than people think. But I don't know, did Sainz have a different upgrade to Leclerc? Because he was like 2.5 tenths off Leclerc's pace today. So very intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Classic Mercedes shenanigans today as well, when Lewis says and George says. George said, to be fair, that he was only half a sandwich away from out-qualifying Sainz, which is probably true. And he was only half a tenth off, or half a second off. But half a second is a pretty big margin in Formula 1. And Hamilton says, yeah, the car was pretty good yesterday. And then today, all of a sudden, the car doesn't have a rear end. So, you know, how many times are we going to hear this here from Mercedes, that their car is good on Friday and is kind of competitive in practice, and then it falls away from them as the weekend goes on, despite the upgrades they have supposedly brought to their car. Leclerc, though, you know, his eyes are certainly forward, and this is an interesting time for the sport now, because Leclerc is saying, look, we can't be happy, we're further away than we thought we'd be, but he did also say, look, the strategy is there, the pace is there, so my target is still to win. Imola is very tough to overtake at, as Bruno Fernandes-Enjoya says in the replies. So, you know, it's not going to be easy at all. Obviously, Piastri then gets the three-place penalty for the impeding incident with Magnussen, so Piastri is now down to P5. So the grid goes Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc, Sainz, Piastri, then Russell. So actually, it's Norris is in the mix, but Leclerc's now boosted up to P3, which means that while the two McLarens can't necessarily work together on strategy, if, you know, the McLaren and of Norris and Leclerc and all this are very close to Max, they can make life difficult for Max. And Piastri has now been asked, look, can you win? And he says, yeah. Normally in the past would have said no, but we're learning to say yes. So this is the belief that is now starting to flood. And yes, Max got pole, but that doesn't tell the entire story of the day. Perez, of course, with a bit of a shocker, obviously, that we'll talk about maybe tomorrow if that continues, but mainly on what's happening elsewhere and the fact that it's a very tight field at the top, and there isn't really that much reason to believe that Red Bull's race pace will be mega compared to the race pace of the McLaren and the Ferrari. Max is still going to be the favourite, obviously, but it's certainly not over yet, and for the championship fight at that. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.